So this is Game Design 2, Lecture 2, Segment 3, where we're going to talk about Milieu. And in our mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics model here, our MDA model, we've added this white box around it to discuss Milieu. And to try to define what Milieu is, the best way I can put it in context of games where it's relevant to us in this course and in our line of work is its individuality. It's what the player brings to the table. It's their personal preferences, their upbringing, their creed, their culture, their race, their social prowess, even religion and morals and ethics. All of these things that define who we are as an individual. When we look at how that affects our reaction to our mechanics and our dynamics and their resulting effect on the aesthetic of the game, we call that Milieu. So for this, I'm going to use a couple examples to kind of drive home some points about Milieu. If you recall from the last segment, jump scares, if I were to poll the class, how many students love jump scares, how many students hate jump scares, it'd probably be somewhere close to 50-50, 30-70. Some players love them, some players hate them, just like movies. Some people love horror movies, some people don't like horror movies because of that neuroticism feel. We don't like feeling anxious or scared. Other individuals love it. So that difference is Milieu. And again, in that case, this is the question I'd like to ask. In the last segment, I asked, do you think it's predictable that when a player turns around and sees a creepy dentist in their face that they shoot it? I said yes, highly predictable, 95% plus. I would predict that a player is going to shoot that dentist. And that they might, utter an expletive and continue to shoot it a couple times and be all giddy afterwards and kind of enjoy the fact that they got scared, but now they're all right. So here's the question. What if it was your mom? What if it was your mom playing BioShock 1 and she was confronted with the scary dentist? Would she utter expletives and shoot it and giggle afterwards? I don't think my mom would have. I think my mom probably would have slid away from the computer, pushed the keyboard away, and never touched the computer again. Right? Not to check email, not to browse the web. That computer is evil, and she wouldn't have found it funny at all. Why is that? Because my mom is a very different person than our average BioShock player. So we'll talk about demographics later. It's acceptable to put in there, but you got to understand, different players, different individual people are going to react very differently to the exact same mechanics. And that's why we add this segment on Milieu, so that students, when they're making their designs, can go into it with eyes open, knowing what the potential outcome from their mechanics are going to be. So let's look at some examples. Again, I'm going to start extreme and then work it back to something a little more normal, a little more mainstream, So here we go. Who can name these two games? So they were both released in 2002. They are both first-person shooters. They both largely have the same mechanics. They're very mechanically similar. I walk around, I have a gun, I'm shooting enemies, I'm traversing through environments. If you haven't guessed it yet, the game on the left is Medal of Honor Frontline. Fantastic World War II first-person shooter, thought of kind of like the grandfather of the genre. And the goal was to defeat the Nazis. So your enemies were Nazis, and you shoot Nazis, and you try not to get shot, and try to win the war. There you go. Now, these mechanics are very similar to the game on the right, which I hope nobody knew. I've never had anybody actually say, oh, I know what that game is, because this one is known as ethnic cleansing. Yeah, ethnic cleansing. Let that one sink in. Here, instead of shooting Nazis, you are a Nazi. In fact, it was produced as a hate piece by white supremacists. The enemies here are anybody of color. So the whole purpose of this game is to target and kill any kind of person that is not the same ethnicity as you. Pretty terrible. Horrific, in fact. But mechanically, almost identical. So it is an extreme example. The game on the left is a great game. Try it out. Lots of great mechanics, things to be learned. The game on the right is total trash. You couldn't find it if you tried. Please don't try. Again, my belief is that they released it just so some news or media outlet would pick it up, and they could have that as a platform to spread their hate. This wasn't actually a mainstream game that they hoped to make money off of. But propaganda games are out there. You need to be aware. And again, same mechanics, very different feeling, very different player experience, very different milieu kicking in. And I dare say that there are some individuals who feel even more strongly about this horrific piece of garbage than even I do. And I do take it very seriously. So you're like, hey, Fairchild, hang on a second. That's cheating. That's an extreme example. That was never meant to be a mainstream game. I'm not buying it. So to that, I will introduce you to this one. This is known as, this game you can still get on Steam today. It's called Slave Trade. Yeah, Slave Trade. Just let this screenshot sink in for just a minute. How does it make you feel? What is your aesthetic just to this one single still image? Does it seem creepy? Does it seem out of place? Is there just something wrong with it that you can't put your finger on? Very normal if you feel that way. In fact, and I won't go into the psychology of it, but two different parts of the brain, one that is the part that has the capability for speech, and the other that is where all of our feelings and emotions come from, they don't talk very well to each other. And the part of our brain that senses emotions has no capacity for communication. So that's why we sometimes will say, I don't know why, but I just don't feel right about this. Or I can't put my finger on it, but there's something wrong with that guy or that situation or that thing or that game or this image. And I believe that that's what happens here. And my explanation for it, and I'm working through it with students, the fancy word is juxtaposition. It's the contrast between the very serious gravity of the nature of this subject matter. Slavery is a very serious hot button topic, and then it's portrayed in this very cartoony, light-hearted, cel-shaded kind of whimsical way. And the fact that we are presenting something so serious in such a non-serious manner, the two don't jive, and the player, the audience, the viewer is left just feeling uneasy about it, just uncomfortable with it. And if that doesn't make you uncomfortable, let me play some gameplay footage. This is from the XKCDC Zero Punctuation guy. He did a review of it. By no means is endorsing it. Let's take a look and see what happens when we actually play the game.
Here's the fun mini-game that everyone's been waiting for. Slave packing. This could be a standalone iOS game, I'm sure. Now you have to think like an old-school slave merchant. You've got to pack as many slaves as possible into the hold of the ship. How come the slave traders were so inhumane? Use the arrow keys to move the slaves into the... I love that. That one small sentence of condemnation before it's right back to the game. Right. Oh, God. Right, so, if you've just joined us, welcome to Slave Tetris. It's Slave Tetris, everybody.
How does that make you feel? Crazy uncomfortable? Awkward? It's pretty terrible, right? I mean, Tetris mechanics are tried and true. They've been repurposed, redone, re-implemented many different ways in many different types of games. So the puzzle mechanics of Tetris are solid. But when they are used to present this type of story, of narrative, it just doesn't work. In fact, it leaves people not just uneasy, but often angry. And by the way, if you're ever watching this, when I do this lecture live in class, some students will laugh. And it's not that anybody thinks that this is funny. It's actually a very common coping mechanism that our brain employs when we see something very, very uncomfortable. We laugh at it. It's a defense mechanism, so we're not completely scarred by these horrific things or these very uncomfortable things that we see. So if you're ever watching something like this and somebody laughs, just know that it's not that they think it's funny. They're just trying to cope with how uncomfortable it is. Yeah, now, I want to give the developers the benefit of the doubt. I mean, you can go to Steam, look at this. By the way, they have removed the slave Tetris part of the game. Too little too late, in my opinion. But the developer will tell you that the purpose of this game was to educate a younger population about the horrors of slavery, so we know history lest we be doomed to repeat it. Now, as a high concept bullet list, I love everything about that idea. I've told you that I'm big into serious games and educational games and just education in general. I would much rather young adults, adolescents, and children learn by playing games as opposed to just watching videos, reading books, or classroom lectures. I like engaging methods for teaching and learning. So if a student team came to me and said, hey, Fairchild, for our project, we're going to make an educational game about how horrible slavery was so everybody learns from it and won't do that again in the future, I'd be like, yes, that sounds awesome. But if you then continued to show me some concept art with very lighthearted, whimsical presentation and graphics, I would say, you know what? You might want to focus test that one. Because whereas I'm going to give the developer the benefit of the doubt that their intentions were good in the development of this title, their implementation failed miserably. And I would speculate that that is because they didn't appropriately test, collect, and analyze data. Because it just takes one focus group with a little diversity in it to look at this screenshot and some of their gameplay and say, yeah, that's not going to work. And if they would have done that prior to release, they could have probably avoided the storm that came after they released it to the general public. So again, a bit of a kind of a extreme, less extreme, but kind of middle ground release here where intentions were good, implementation was terrible. Our milieu kicks in and makes us uncomfortable with these mechanics. Even though a story-based, quest-based game with mini games and challenges like Tetris and other puzzle mechanics, very tried and true staple for game designers. But in this case, I'm just going to have to say it doesn't work. So let's move on to our final example. And if you recognize this is Papers, Please. So I'm going to play their teaser video here. And this is, it's not necessarily about gameplay, but it will give you the general idea of what the game is all about. So here we go. So Papers, Please is a game where you are told to be a border patrol agent by the ruling communist government of the fictitious country that they have it set in. And your job is to check for discrepancies between passports and documents and papers with the rule of the day. Like certain individuals have to be searched, others aren't allowed to be omitted, etc., etc. And by the success in which you do this is what determines how much money you get, and you need to use that money to pay for bills, to keep the power on so your family doesn't freeze. Your children might get sick, so you'll need to earn extra money to pay for medicine, etc., etc. If you can suspend disbelief or really immerse yourself into the narrative part of the story, Papers, Please has fantastic, meaningful decisions. For example, an individual might come in and give you his papers as well as an extra $100 and say, look, I really need to get in. I need to cross the border to get this medicine to my sick kid. Now, in the plot, in the narrative, you might have just been told that your kid is sick. So that extra $100, that would pay for the medicine that you need, and you can identify with this NPC who needs to get his sick kid medicine. What do? You think there might be two choices to either say yes or no, but there's a third. You can also just take his money and still deny him entry, the really jerk move. Which again, if we don't suspend disbelief and we just focus on the mechanics, I get the money, I deny the NPC because he's just an NPC, and there's not real people we're talking about here, kind of loses some of its effect. But this is where narrative can be a mechanic in and of itself and important to the aesthetic. If I can really buy into the fact that I've got a sick kid and he's got a sick kid, you might be tempted to let him in anyway. Make a little less because you made a mistake, but make that extra $100 on the side. So unlike the last two, is this an okay game? Is this should we be worried about Milieu kicking in and upsetting folks? Well, I would say yeah. I mean, we should definitely consider it. I think Papers, Please is a fantastic game that any aspiring designer could learn a lot from, and I would recommend that you check it out. The other two, not so much. Definitely not ethnic cleansing, and probably not even slave trade, except to learn what not to do. But even in this case of a decent game with good mechanics and a proper presentation, it could potentially kick in and upset some folks, say, that might have been trapped under an authoritarian regime. Or maybe they couldn't get medicine or supplies to loved ones or family members that were in a bad spot. You know, what happened with the hurricane recently and certain areas where just the help and the support wasn't available and we couldn't even get into there. That might stir up feelings in an individual where they're like, I don't want to play this game. Hits a little bit too close to home. Now, am I saying that you shouldn't make a game that's going to offend somebody? Absolutely not, because somebody out there is going to be offended at whatever you do. The moral of the story is to look at it from a different perspective and realize you're not making games for you, you're making games for the public. And the public is comprised of a lot of different individuals with different opinions and upbringings and feelings. And you should really focus test as much as you can to make sure that some of your mechanics and the presentation thereof aren't going to be misconstrued. So that's my bit on Milieu.